How do you feel about being Retailer of the Year?
It's humbling, that's all I can say. To have somebody in the town of Bad Axe of 3,000 people in the entire United States, unbelievable.
What do you think got you to this point right now?
There's no doubt in anybody's mind it's a 450 Bushmaster. That idea was just hatched right here in Bad Axe. They just were nice enough to actually continue and build my dream, and that dream turned into something a lot of people wanted, and that's what got us to Retailer of the Year. There's no doubt in anybody's mind. We sell a lot of other Rugers, we just can't compare with that.
Is there anything else that you want to add?
Just thank you for all the customers, because without somebody buying these guns, doesn't matter how many I order, and we've got so many variations, we've got something for everybody, that if you want a pink one, if you want a green one, if you want a compact one, we've got all of them, and we'll set one up especially for you the way you want it.
Perfect. Thank you very much again. It's very nice to meet you.
Appreciate it.
I think Ruger's at mid 30,000, 35,000 roughly now that we've got out in the country, which I think was a number 2 rifle in Ruger last year. Yep. So, and we have a new model over there called a Go Wild. It's a Cerakote model that's introduced here. Also, we introduced a exclusive that we said everybody would never see one. Kevin, hold that scout rifle up. This is a brand new stainless scout rifle. It will be introduced to the rest of the world next week, I believe, the 30th. But everybody in Bad Axe gets to see it first. So that's it. Of course, the people from Lipsy's, they have a lot of exclusives too between Jason and Flint. There's about 30 different exclusive Rugers that we do at the store through their distributorship. So I think at that point, everybody's been waiting basically for Richard. Let me introduce Richard Lipsy. Come on up. Do a little story here. And this is what people are waiting for. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, Randy. And I would like to thank everybody here for coming. I never imagined, first I'm not sure I knew where Bad Axe was. And, I'm from Louisiana. We went from the very south to the very north. And Randy very cordially invited me to come up here, and I'm certainly happy to do it. But I'd like to thank Randy and Arlene and their entire family. I knew there were a bunch of boys. I didn't know there were a whole covey of them, but wow, that's impressive. And I'd like to thank Carla for helping us get this thing going over here.
One more thing.
Sure.
One more last thing. I know Carlos getting it going. We're going to be playing a slideshow and presentation while he's talking through this.
I just can't thank everybody enough for coming. And I was just thinking, I'll tell you a real brief story. Back in the late 80s, almost 30 years ago, I heard Flint talking to a customer on the telephone. He said, yes, Randy. Okay, well, I'll hold a couple of those for you when they come in. So, a few days later, I hear Flint, our desks were 10 feet apart. He said, yeah, Randy, I'll hold one of those for you. Sure, I'll hold one of those for you. So I said, oh, Flint, who are you talking to? He says, well, I'm talking to Randy Brown. I said, oh, okay. A few days later, I hear Flint talking and saying, Randy, ordered this, ordered that. I said, Flint, tell me what the hell is going on? And he said, well, Randy Brown is ordering some guns. I said, but why? I just couldn't figure that out. And then Flint looked at me and I looked at him, and it dawned on me, that Randy Brown was my wife's OBGYN. And he's a hell of a gun enthusiast. But he never bought that many guns. And so my introduction to Randy, and I brought Randy Brown in my booth, the other Randy Brown, to meet Randy Brown. One of them's big and tall, one of them's short and fat. But they're both really damn good friends. And 30 years, almost 30 years, Randy, that you've been Randy's hunting our distinguished dealer in 1993. Hell, you ought to get it every year. But let me tell you, Randy Brown here does a hell of a job. What a great sportsman he is, and how innovative, Randy, you are in things you've done. Remarkable with that 450 and all the other things that you do, and the way you get around the state, and all the promotions and the things you've done to promote the great outdoors. I'm going to tell you all a story tonight, and it's a true story. We're not going to talk fiction. We're going to talk facts. So, and I'll be glad at the end of it to answer any questions. And I think what we'll do at the end of my talk, Randy will probably give his raffles and prizes and do a little of that. Then I'll come back up here and answer any questions you have. I'll be glad to stay as long tonight as anybody wants to visit with you individually or anything else. But I could not believe that when I walked on the campus, matter of fact, in 1957, college campus, LSU, as a proud freshman, that 6 years, almost just 6 years later, I would be watching the funeral of, I think, one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. So let me just take a minute and tell you how I got there. I went to ROTC, which I'll bet a lot of you guys here did too, and I bet there are a lot of veterans in the office, in the audience, and I'm very proud of every darn one of you. And I went through school, and I was supposed to go to law school, but 1961, and I know there are a lot of guys close to my age in the room, and a lot of you that remember the Berlin crisis. And so when I graduated, they would not let us go to law school or any graduate school. They decided that we should all go directly in the service. And I'm talking about if there was ever a place that should have been a nuclear test site, that's it. But anyhow, I got over to Camp Polk, and so I was assigned a bunch of different duties, from being a platoon leader to being the special services officer to being the post billeting officer. In a few weeks, I learned a great deal about Camp Polk, and the regular army was moving in and the reserves were moving out. So when the new general came in to run the post, they called on me to give him a tour of the post. That night, I got orders from our chief of staff to go to the general's home. I did that. And now remember, I'm a second lieutenant, just turned 22 years old. And anyhow, he asked me if I would be his aide de camp. I had no idea what that was. No idea. But he explained it to me. He and his wife and 6 children. And, but all ages, from a freshman in college to 8 years old, 7 years old. And anyhow, I did that. A wonderful man, General Philip C. Wheel, and I became his aide, and literally like his junior aide. 2 months later, General Wheel was called by the Chief of Staff of the Army in Washington and asked if he would like to take over as the commanding general of the military district of Washington. And of course, General Wheel's family was from Virginia. So what a great place for him to end up his career in Washington. So the general said he was going to Washington, and he sent his, as generals normally do when they move posts, he sent his senior aide to the National War College, the general, to become the capacity to move up to be a general. And he asked me, would you like to go to Washington? Well, let me tell you, anything to get away from Fort Polk. And even though I was from Louisiana, I was only 3 hours from my home. But anyhow, I gladly followed him to Washington. The first day we get to Washington, we go to see the Chief of Staff, who was then Earl Wheeler, General, 4-star General Earl Wheeler. He tells General Wheeler when we walk in, he says, Phil, he said, I know this is a big post for you, and it's a big job. You know, you're supposed to meet and greet every head of state that comes to Washington. You're ahead of every affair that happens in Washington. You will be giving cocktail parties. You know, you'll be going to the White House numerous times per week. And he said, I've got a colonel and a major picked out for your aides. General Wheeler looked right back at him. He said, I don't think that'll be necessary. Richard can do that for me. And I was shocked and taken back, but I was also very pleased. So he says, well, what do we do next? He said, you go from here to the White House to meet the president. This is our first day in Washington in uniform. And so we left the Chief of Staff in the Pentagon. We drove over to the White House. We go into the White House, walked up. Evelyn Lincoln, who was President Kennedy's secretary at the time, assistant, said, yes, please come right on in. We went in the office. The president was there, greeted us, told General Wheeler they had 2 little sofas in the middle of the room with a table. The president said, General Wheeler, you sit there. I'll sit right here. He said, Lieutenant, you sit right there in my rocking chair. So that was my first meeting with President John F. Kennedy, was being invited to sit into his rocking chair. You know, a lot of things have happened since that meeting in 1961. We flew in 1961. If those of you probably don't remember, but the historians will know that we flew into space in 1961. In 1963, there was a ban on nuclear testing. I mean, look today. We're trying to do basically the same thing. Still trying to get nuclear weapons out of the hands of the bad guys. 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Just not too long after that, we'd lost President Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy died. His son, John Kennedy Jr. died. The brothers, Bobby, was assassinated. Ted Kennedy died. So there have been a lot of movies, as you probably know, and a lot of books written on the Kennedy assassination and on JFK. Most of them are very fictitious, as like Oliver Stone's movie JFK. This recent movie Jackie. They were both good movies, but they didn't quite follow the truthful storyline. And that's what I want to investigate with you tonight a little bit more and talk about the truth, talk about the facts. So let me just go ahead and move it and talk a little bit more about President Kennedy, just to give you the background. First, he was a man of vision. He was always looking forward, looking to the future. He wanted to know where our country was going. He knew where we had been. He was a real study in history. But he was interested in taking our country forward. And with that said, you can imagine he really cared about what musicians said, what painters said, what great writers were talking about. he listened to all of those people in trying to make his decisions what was best for our country. So I learned very early on, that he was a man of vision. He was to be respected, and I didn't agree. I was a young man, and quite honestly, I was not a Democrat. But I learned to appreciate the fact that he was a great leader, and that he really was trying to do his best, the best he could for our country. This is kind of what you call, I guess, the beginning of Camelot. This was the great dream. The beautiful young bride, Jackie Kennedy, the handsome lieutenant, the World War II veteran, distinguished family, and it really kind of laid all on the line. Just to give you just a little more insight, 1961, when the president was in, we were in the Berlin crisis, as I told you. He made this statement. I'm just going to read a couple of them to you tonight, very short, brief ones. This is one of them. And if you're any study of Jack Kennedy, you would have read this or remembered this when he went to Berlin. And although it was 1989, think about that, 28 years later, when the Berlin Wall came down, this is what he said in 1961 in his great Ich bin ein Berliner speech. I hear it said that West Berlin is militarily untenable, and so it was Bastogne, and so in fact was Stalingrad. Any dangerous spot is tenable if men, brave men, will make it so. We have previously indicated in our readiness to remove any actual irritants in West Berlin, but the freedom of the city is not negotiable. We cannot negotiate with people that say, what's mine is mine, and what is yours is negotiable. I listened to that, I heard that, and could only imagine that one day East and West Berlin would be one. It took a long time. But just like putting a man on the moon in 1969, John Kennedy said we were going to put a man on the moon, and Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And it took till the Reagan era to get the wall down, but it did come down. And hopefully one day we won't be threatened by our enemies with nuclear destruction as we are today, not only from North Korea but Iran. And then of course we have our problems with Russia, but that's beside the point right now. So let's talk about a little bit about what happened on that fateful day in November of 1963. I'll talk a little bit about it, and I'll give you a few slides to give you a little bit better description of what happened basically after the assassination. And so let me just begin to tell you where I was. I was standing every morning. Our driver and I in Washington would pick up the general, pick him up sharp 6:30 every morning. We lived at Fort Myer, Virginia, which many of you, I'm sure you know, right across the river from Washington, right kind of part of Arlington Cemetery, right up the hill at the top of Arlington Cemetery. We'd pick up the general, we'd cross the river, and our offices were at Fort McNair, which is about a mile or less from the Capitol. And we'd go to our office, we'd work till basically 11:30, take the general home. He would have lunch. I'd run across the street to the BOQ where I lived and have lunch, and then the driver would come pick me up. We'd go back behind the general's house in his driveway and stand there and just wait on him, and he'd come out pretty much promptly at 1 o'clock, and we'd go to the office and work till whenever. This particular day, same thing had gone on. We had had lunch, standing outside, the radio was playing in the automobile, and this was an old, very old four-door, you'll see a picture of it in a few minutes, very old four-door Cadillac, and we had a phone in there. It was a red phone in there and a black phone in there. Now remember, this is 1963, and they weren't the ones like you have today. This was one of those ones where you had to hope if you picked it up and hit a button, somebody at the distance out there somewhere would answer. So we're standing there, and we hear on the news that the president, the radio station interrupted, the president's been shot. And I looked at the driver, he looked at me, and it probably took 15 seconds. We just stood there and stared at each other, just, you know, was this a joke? Were they playing George Orwell, you know, or something like that? But no, it wasn't. So I started running to the general's house, and boy, the door flew open. The general comes running out. Did you hear the news? I said, yes, sir, we just heard the news. He said, let's go. We jumped in the car and headed out of Fort Myer. Before we got out of Fort Myer, there was this black phone and the red phone, and quite honestly, the general never used either one of them, but the red phone went directly to the president's office, and it never rung in the over a year, 18 months or so that I'd been in Washington. And that red phone rang, and it was Mrs. Lincoln, the president's assistant, saying, oh my God, get to the White House. And so we start across the bridge there where Arlington is. If you're familiar with it, nice, wide road, beautiful Memorial Bridge, and it was jam-packed, stopped. Everybody, there were a few cars in one lane moving, but mostly stopped. And people outside just, you know, in tears and just like, what in the world just happened to our country? And so our driver gets up on the sidewalk of Memorial Bridge. Thank God there were nobody walking across it. It's a long bridge. And we go down the sidewalk all the way to the other side. He manages to get over to Pennsylvania Avenue, going down the wrong way on a one-way. We get to the White House. By the time we get to the White House, we have heard on the radio that it's been confirmed that the president indeed was shot and that the president is probably dead. When we walk into the White House, of course, we go in there, everybody's pandemonium, everybody is in hysterics, and of course, they don't know whether this is a conspiracy against the United States. The vice president's been whisked off to an underground place in Virginia, in Northern Virginia, and the cabinet has gone to another place, and the Supreme Court has gone to another place. Kind of reminds me of that TV show, Lone Survivor, that's on now, or The Survivor that's on. Anyhow, they confirmed the president was dead. There was nothing we could do. One of the things that General Wheel was in charge of was state funerals. Now, President Eisenhower was alive, Hoover was alive, Harry Truman was alive. We had stacks of books, what we do in case a president dies, and exactly where to bury him, how to bury him, and it was all laid out. We had nothing for President Kennedy, but we had the funerals planned for the others. So, but obviously the general plan is pretty much the same. So we go back to our offices, we start the plan, we get a call that the plane is taken off from Dallas and that they're on the way back to Washington, and the plane is going to land around 6 p.m. at Andrews Air Force Base. So the general and I'm helping the general. Our chief of staff, by the time we got back to our office, had assembled the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, the Washington Police, the Coast Guard, the general officers that you cannot imagine. A room, it didn't have as many people in this room, but had well over 100 people in the room, all with books and notebooks of, ready to participate in planning the funeral. So we had that work done that afternoon, and we headed out to Andrews Air Force Base. We met the plane when it came in, and all of this is on television all the time. And I know if you're any fan of that era, you've seen it so many times on TV. You can see the FBI and the Secret Service up there trying to get the casket off the airplane and down. And so finally, we brought with us the honor guard from the 3rd Infantry, led by a very close friend of mine, Sam Bird, first lieutenant, and they got the casket off. We got it down. We got it into this very drab gray ambulance, is what it was, a Navy ambulance that we were using as a hearse, and got it in there. Jackie got into the hearse with the body. Our car was in front. So once everybody was loaded up in this long procession, with General Wheel was a great guy. You just cannot imagine how intelligent he was, and he had it all laid out. We had one of these big banana helicopters, the ones with the rotors on both ends, holds about 30 people. And we had a helicopter waiting for us. We put a Marine honor guard as well as the burial honor guard from the 3rd Infantry with us in the helicopter. We took off and then told our driver to proceed, and we flew ahead to the Bethesda Naval Hospital so we would be there before the body got there so that we could make sure everything was in order. So we get there, we land in the middle of about 5,000 people, on a little helipad, probably 20 by 20 or not very big, with just thousands of people surrounding it. Scared the living, what out of me, and the general too. We get off, and believe it or not, the general goes around to thank the pilot, for getting us safely. It was a guy younger than I was, and it was quite a frightful flight, but we all got there okay. So when we get out, the general says, I'm going to the front door, and I'll meet Jackie Kennedy. You go to the back, and you meet the casket in the morgue. Well, what I didn't know was that the general had put another car in there, and when he got at the gate, they moved Jackie to another ambulance. When they came in, that ambulance came to the front of the Bethesda Naval Hospital so that the whole crowd followed it. The ambulance with the body went around the back, so nobody followed it. And then we brought it back to the back of the morgue. I was there with but the 3rd Infantry funeral honor guard. And they backed up. We pulled the casket out, which had been furnished there in Dallas by Parkland Hospital. And we pulled it out, brought it in, and put it on the floor. Next to it, this at the morgue, the room was probably 25, maybe not even 20, about 25 by 25, 20 by 20. And on one end of the room, one side of the room, was this 6-7 foot long stainless steel table, and at the end of it some shelves and lights. And then as far as you are from me, there were 2 rows elevated just like this stage, so that the people sitting here is, from me to you, could observe the autopsies in that room. And so that's where I was to sit here. And before we left our office that afternoon, General Wheel, we went in his office, he opened the drawer, and he pulled out 2 gun belts. One had a .32 automatic in it, and he put it on. The other one was a web belt, a regular Army web belt with a .45 and a old leather holster. And he handed that to me and he says, "You put this on." And he says, "When we get that plane, that body off the airplane, and we take it to the hospital," he said, "you are responsible for it." And he said, "You're the only person that's going to be in the room with the president and watch that autopsy." So that kind of dispels for you the movie JFK that shows pandemonium in that room with all the doctors running around and people and craziness. It was not at all. It was very, very formal. 3 doctors, a couple of technicians. But we opened the casket, and at that time it's myself and 2 technicians. And they come in, and then a cameraman comes in. We get the body. I help the 2 technicians. We lift the body out of the casket, put it on that cold stainless steel table. And then they take a lot of pictures, and then take a bunch of x-rays, and then they left. Another tech came in, and this other tech and myself proceeded with a bucket and a couple of brushes, light brushes and rags. We proceeded to clean the body off and wait then for the doctors to come in, and they almost immediately came in. Now, I need to tell you that this was the first deceased person I had ever seen. And, you know, I'm 23 years old now. I'd never seen a dead man. And here I've just picked up the nude body of the President of the United States and laid him on this table and helped wash him off. And it's kind of, and I know some of you have been through it before when you've had an automobile accident or something happened like that. You just don't, you don't realize where you are or what you're doing. You just do it. And that was the kind of experience that I had at that moment, looking down at the body of President Kennedy. So the doctors came in, I sat down, and I sat there for 3 hours. I watched every movement while the doctors proceeded to do a complete autopsy, where they start by cutting the body like this and lifting up the chest cavity. And of course, they were looking because they had the bullet wound behind the back of his head. They had an exit wound here, which we did not know. They did not know at the time whether that was where they had done a tracheotomy or was it an exit wound. They didn't know what it was. But they proceed then to do the autopsy. They're looking for the bullets because now they know 3 shots were fired. But after a definitive time during this autopsy, they can only find 2 bullet wounds. And so where was that 3rd bullet, which turns out, of course, the mysterious bullet, that, you know, that they don't know where that last shot went, but they found 1 bullet pretty much intact laying on the floor of the car. 1 bullet had gone through the president, then through, I guess, the Treasury Secretary, then Connolly, and gone through his wrist or whatever, landed on the floor. And so you all know, you've seen that picture. You've seen the picture in Washington, I mean in Dallas, where the president's driving, the bullet hits him from the rear. He reaches forward, grabs his throat, and all at once his head thrusts back, which is Newton's law. You know, when that bullet comes out, it's going to be a propulsion going back. So it was just a horrible thing. But I sat there for 3 hours, watched the autopsy. Then, when the autopsy is over, or just about over, General Wheel comes down. He had met Jackie, taken up to the 17th floor of Naval Bethesda Hospital to the presidential suite, where they began to plan the funeral. And believe me, Jackie had, just in that brief length of time, she had plans of exactly what she wanted. The general had our book there, but Jackie had what she wanted done. I mean, this is now, she's only, what, 35 or 36 years old now. But she wanted the Irish Guard there. She wanted certain dignitaries on the front row. She wanted the cars lined up like this. She wanted that procession from Washington, from the White House to the Capitol. She said who she wanted to speak at the funeral. She said what church they wanted to go to for the funeral. I mean, she had lots of plans in her mind already. So General Wheel comes down, briefs me very briefly about some of the plans, brings me a hamburger. We hadn't eaten all day, and quite honestly, it was very difficult at that moment to eat a hamburger. But I did. And the general said, let's lock this room up, run back to our quarters. We were in our green uniforms, and let's change into our dress blues. And so we locked the room up. I locked the room up, put a guard at both entrances, and jumped in the car. The driver flew back to our quarters. On the way back, we got a call from Jackie Kennedy, already called the White House. So when our driver dropped us off, in about a 14 or 15 minute time, he drove back across from Fort Myer to the White House. They had the clothes ready, picked up the clothes, came back, picked the general and myself up. In less than 45 minutes, we were back at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. The people from Gallard's funeral home were there waiting on us. I opened the room up, 3 men from Gallard's and myself went into the room, nobody else, and then I sat there for another 3.5 hours while Gallard's put the president's body literally back together, did an absolutely beautiful job of it. And at the end of that 3.5 hours period, now it's 4 o'clock in the morning, this other gentleman and myself from Gallard's, we dressed the president, we picked the president up, and we laid him in the new coffin that we brought in, the new casket, and that was another moment, standing there looking down at the President of the United States, laying in that coffin, and then the guy from the Gallard's tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Lieutenant, we have to close it." And I guess that was probably one of the most rude awakenings I've ever had, that, you know, this was it. And we closed the casket. We had the car pull around the back. I let the honor guard in. We put the casket back into the same Navy ambulance. And then I look at my watch, it's just a little after 4 o'clock. The general comes in. He says, "Are we ready to go?" "Yes, sir." He said, "Do you have an honor guard waiting on us at the White House?" I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "Well, you damn sure better get one there." So I go out in the hall and I get on a payphone. Now I will back up just one split second. Between the autopsy and when Gollard's funeral home came in, I did make one telephone call before General Wheeler and I left to go change clothes, and I called my parents to tell them where I was. Well, of course, they said, "Well, we've seen you on TV. What is going on?" I said, "Well, that I cannot tell you, but I have just watched the autopsy of the President of the United States. That's all I can tell you." And the reason that was all I could tell them was about halfway through the autopsy, there was a knock at the door. I reached over, and there was a Secret Service guy that came in about every 45 minutes just to ask me how far along they were. And I thought that's who it was, but it was a man in a business suit, and he told me to step out. So I stepped out. He said he was here. He wanted me to sign these papers. I said, "What papers are those?" He said, "I'm from the Department of State. This is the National Securities Act, and you need to sign this, that you cannot tell anyone what you have seen for 15 years under penalty of a $25,000 fine or 10 years in jail." And I signed it, and for 15 years, I could not tell my wife, which I got married a year later, or my parents, or anybody what went on during that period of 6.5 hours sitting in that room. So anyhow, I'm going to try to wrap this up in a pretty short period of time over there, Randy, but I'd like to show you a few slides. May take a minute to get this going because we've been playing with it all day. What that represents right there, everybody knows who those 4 gentlemen are. 4 presidents of the United States who were assassinated. Now, unfortunately, I did have a little film I wanted to show you, but we're going to have to pass on that. We'll go right into this little presentation with, this is mostly right here. It starts briefly right when we find out the president's been shot, and then it goes on really after what I just described to you. Here's President Kennedy and Jackie getting off the airplane in Dallas. This is what, 15, 20 minutes later? I know you cannot read that, but this is the actual copy of that came across the ticker tape saying that the president's been shot. And this is just, minutes later where it comes across that President Kennedy and Governor John Connally were cut down by assassin's bullet. And then moments later, when it comes back to talking about the president, it is dead. Now we move forward from that moment where they went to Parkland, and then they fly back to Washington. Here's Jackie getting into the Navy ambulance, which we're using for Hearst that I described to you. And that I told you from that moment where we went back to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, performed the autopsy, put the body back together, and then when General Wheel told me at 4 o'clock in the morning did I have an honor guard, and I did not. I thought he had presumed that we were going to use, and we were using still the Third Army. He meant a real honor guard at the White House. I called the Marine barracks on a payphone. I interrupted myself while I go tell you I called my parents. That same payphone, I called a captain that was a friend of mine at the Marine barracks that was some, 10 miles from Fort Myer. Woke him up, told him that we were getting ready in the next 10 minutes to leave Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that I needed an honor guard at the White House. We left in about 10 minutes. We drove very slowly because we did have a lot of cars in there, but I also told the driver, our sergeant driving us, to drive very slowly. We got to the White House in about 25 minutes from the time I had called Marine Barracks to the time we got there. He had wakened up the Marine Honor Guard, 18 guys. They had shaved, dressed, and were bussed to the White House and beat us there. And while I don't have a picture of them, I just have to tell you about it. They were lined up in just that short period of time, greeting us. Here we are going into the, Richard, I think I screwed it up. Carly, you may have to, I meant to use the pointer, get me back on there. And here I am, here we are bringing the body into the White House. This is me in the middle, and this is the honor guard from the 3rd Infantry carrying it into the White House. Here is right after the body goes in. Here's Jackie Kennedy, and there I am standing in the middle. Here we are in the east room of the warehouse. When we heard the news, one thing that afternoon that we did, we sent a crew out to find the catafalque that was used during the Abraham Lincoln's funeral. And they found it, and that's it, where the body is resting. And you can see how few people there are in this room. There are a couple of the White House attendants at that end. There is one of the fellas from the honor guard from the Fort Myer, from Arlington Cemetery. Jackie, I was shocked when they got to Washington, and I was shocked when she came down and we left to go back to Bethesda. She refused to take off that pink suit that was blood-stained top to bottom, but she was totally composed. I mean, I don't mean this to sound ugly, but I really felt like she had ice water running in her veins. I mean, she just was taking this so darn calmly. It was just incredible. And this is the president's sister, and here I am standing right here. General Wheel is outside talking to other officials and making some plans. At that point, we closed the door and had a private mass, and lasted about 20 minutes, and just, those 12 or 13 people standing in the East Room. At the end of it, Jackie asked everyone to leave, and just she and the priest stayed. And to this day, nobody knows whether or not she opened the casket or not. They only stayed in there, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes, not even that long, 5 minutes. So I don't think she did, but anyhow, here's the next morning, General Wheel and I left. I guess it was 6:30, 7 o'clock we left. Went back to our BOQ, my BOQ, his home, showered, changed clothes, put on a fresh dress uniform, went back to the White House, and greeted a few people, President Truman, President Eisenhower, and then we went back to our office and to complete the planning of the funeral. We had it all planned, and then we would drive from the White House to the Capitol, and about 45 minutes before we were all lined up, had the cars lined up, everybody and all these dignitaries. I mean, security was a nightmare. Can you imagine several hundred dignitaries from around the country and the world were there, heads of state, which you'll see, you wouldn't believe. And we didn't, but you can imagine they had the Secret Service, the FBI, so on and so forth, had in planning security for all of these people. And we had advised many of them that they should plan their own security, but we did the best we could. So just 45 minutes before we leave the White House, Jackie comes out and says, we're going to walk. Can you imagine the next security nightmare that we were facing? We were going to walk from the Capitol, from the White House to the Capitol. Well, Abraham Lincoln's funeral was that way, and she wanted it that way. So we proceeded to walk here from the White House to this General Wheel. This is myself and our Chief of Staff. We proceeded to walk. Right behind us, Jackie, Teddy, Bobby, family, and Secret Service. I'll read one thing to you. I know I'm going a little long, Randy, but I think this will interest you. That is, here we are. This is an old newspaper article. The procession which escorted the body from the White House to the Capitol is one of the most imposing ever seen in Washington. The avenue was cleared the whole length. The sound of the muffled drums was heard, and the procession, with a slow, measured tread, moved from the home of the morning on its mission with the remains of the illustrious dead. Despite the enormous crowd, the silence was profound. Now, that, as you can imagine, sounds just like what was going on. The only difference, it was written 98 years earlier in 1865, describing Abraham Lincoln's funeral. Here we are bringing the body into the Capitol Rotunda. General Wheel is standing right there. I'm over on the other side. This is immediate, and I'm going to kind of go through these a little faster. This is immediately following the funeral speakers at the Capitol. John McCormick, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the Vice President, the Chief Justice Earl Warren, and 3 or 4 others. Here they are coming down the steps with the casket. This is the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Wheel, myself standing right here. Here they are loading the casket onto the caisson. Not the same caisson, but an identical caisson that was used back at President Lincoln's funeral. Here we are still standing over here, body getting ready to leave and move on. And I knew all the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Maxwell Taylor, General Wheeler, as I said, was the Chief of Staff of the Army, but the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I know this name will ring a bell with you, was Curtis LeMay. A little shorter guy, Air Force general, called him a bulldog, always had a cigar in his mouth. And he leans over to me, he says, "Lipsy, come over here." So I walk over to him, he says, "You know damn well that none of us have marched anywhere in 30 years. He said, "You get alongside of us, call us to attention, count cadence, and march us to the St. Matthew's Church." I walked back over, told General Wheel what he said. So General Wheel went and got Colonel Cross, our Chief of Staff, to march with him to lead it. And I marched the Joint Chiefs from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Church. These are the pictures coming out of the church. And you all remember this one. He doesn't have the salute, but where John is standing there and he salutes his father as they come down. We rode from St. Matthew's in a long procession over to Arlington Cemetery. Here we are. You can see the length, and now you can see a good picture of Memorial Bridge, so you can understand what I was talking about if you don't remember going from Arlington Cemetery across to Washington. This was the order of march, and the only reason I put it up there, you can see at the top where the first order is General Philip C. Wheel, Commanding General Military District of Washington. This is coming in to the cemetery itself. There's the Irish Guard. Here's General Wheel, my boss, and here are the head chaplain and Cardinal Cushing from Boston, and the body. I'm standing literally, I came around and I'm standing, that may be my hat right there, but that's where I was standing. And the dignitaries are all standing right in this area when the body was put down. I mean, Haile Selassie, Charles de Gaulle, and just head of every country in the world practically were represented there. This is the next day after the funeral. We brought the now President Lyndon Johnson over there. I'm standing behind General Wheel, so you really can't see me there. But in this picture, now this is literally about 7 or 8 days later. For some reason, the Princess of Monaco, Grace Kelly, who was a close friend of Jackie's, could not come to the funeral. Jackie never forgave her. And when she came to visit Jackie, Jackie would not see her. And we got a telephone call to please take Princess Grace to the cemetery. So General Wheel, the chief of protocol standing right behind General Wheel, Princess Grace, and myself. This picture, believe it or not, was on the front page more than any other picture. This picture was on the front page of every newspaper in the United States. These are just some other pictures that I took at later dates where the president was buried. Of course, that's the Curtis Lee Mansion, which was just above where the president, Jackie had picked the spot where she wanted the president to be buried. This is many years later, the 90s, when I visited the spot. This is just a slide of the president during the autopsy, a picture of showing the angle of where the bullet went in, went out. This just happens to be, unfortunately, where General Wheel is buried. He wanted to be buried near the president, and that's about where I'm standing. Actually, I'm standing on the little facade where the president is buried, and General Wheel is buried right there. A picture from a different angle. The last two photographs I want to show you, I'm really particularly proud of, but they're very unusual. When about a week or so before the president left to go to Dallas, Marshal Tito, who was the communist head of state, president of Yugoslavia, came to visit the president. In those days, you weren't allowed to take a picture of the President of the United States with the head of a communist state. And so I had never in my life taken as many times as I went to the White House, which was many times a week. As you might have noted, I became the president's social aide and worked there at night when I did not have duties with my boss, the general, but I went during the day when a dignitary would come to see the president. I would generally go brief the president on who was coming. General Wheel would meet the dignitary and bring him to the White House. And I came in on this particular day. I had a camera over my shoulder, and I'm getting ready to go in the gate. The guard says, "Lieutenant, you can't take the camera in there." I said, "Why not?" And he starts to tell me, and then there are people lined up, horns blowing, and up walks Pierre Salinger, who is the White House press secretary. I asked, "What's going on?" And I told him, the guard, he tells the guard, "Oh, don't worry about Lipsy. He won't take any pictures." So, and anyhow, we go in. So I go into the president's office, and I'm talking to the president. And I said, "I brought my camera. Would you mind if I took some pictures today?" He said, "Well, I really don't care." But he said, "You're going to catch a lot of flack for it." So I go out there, and I'm standing, and I'm snapping pictures. This particular picture, you can see the president, Pierre Salinger, Dean Russ, the Secretary of State, the president's senior military aides, and then this picture, I had to condense it because of the size of the photograph, but the president, this is Marshal Tito's wife, the interpreter, Dean Rusk, the president's sister, Shriver, and then Marshal Tito, I cut him out, is standing over here. But anyhow, I'm standing, once again, maybe 10, 12 feet from the president, and behind me are about 100 members of the press corps. And I can feel the knives going into my back. Anyhow, I left, I go, the White House, the president gets killed the next week. In the meantime, that weekend before, I had taken some photographs. I pulled this roll out. I take it to the drugstore. Remember drugstores? And remember you took the film out of the camera and took it and left it at the drugstore for a week, and then you went back and picked up your photographs. Well, I left it there, and weeks went by. And now it's the end of December. I'm getting out of the Army, and I remembered that I thought I had some photographs of this weekend I spent somewhere. And so I go pick up the photographs, and I open it up, and they've been sitting there for weeks, and there are all these pictures of the President of the United States, and how those ever did not, get away, I don't know. But I had those photographs. And so just to end, I'll tell you that President Kennedy, as I said before, he was such a bright human being. He was forward-thinking, vision, wanted to know where our country was going, not where we had been. He was thinking about what others could do for our country. He always, told us, stop thinking. He used this in his inaugural speech, but he always told us, don't ask what our country can do for you, but think instead of what you can do for our country. 1963, not too long before he was assassinated, he gave a speech at the American University there in Washington. And he said, if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help the world be safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. Kind of makes you stop and think about what the future is and what he was thinking. It started off in his administration with his beautiful young wife and the president, and it was going to be like the movie Camelot, and it was going to be a wonderful future for him, for his wife, for his children, and our country. But unfortunately, it did not end that way. And as we know it, that day, November the 22nd, 1963, that was the end of Camelot. Thank you.
This guy, he probably deserves a big round of applause anyways. He's a big part of our gun club for Thumb Sportsman's Club. We're putting on a lot of different shoots right now. We've got some long-range rifle shoots, we've got some handgun shoots, and this is our big one. This is our 22 shoot. I couldn't think of somebody that deserves this more right now. Lee McDowell. You just won yourself a bill.
Thank you so much. You can see what he does for us every night with his tickets. Perfect. Thank you, Jim. That's going to the Friends of the NRA here, local Thumb. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Sorry.
Eric, you here? You got a cooler. We're going to save the last cooler to the end because we need it here. What do you want to give away next, Doug? If you have ever talked to Doug, if you were in the store, he comes up a couple times a year. He's the most knowledgeable optics guy literally in the world. I believe it because actually when we were doing these scopes, we were trying to figure out how to do that. Doug was telling the engineers what we needed. And sooner or later they figured it out and made it the way we wanted it. So that's how it goes. Nice pair of beautiful binoculars are going to Tim Rader. He's helped us out on the weekends, and actually we have probably 15 guys in here. There's only 4 guys at our store, but we have a lot of part-timers that go out on the road with us to these banquets, and Tim did that for years. He was a great buddy of our son Jason, took him on some vacations, so well done. Go ahead, Doug.
This is a
Laser.
laser rangefinder that fits on a bow or a crossbow. You can actually put it on a rifle too if you want, because it's got a mount but that clamps on.
David Lee, Deckerville Sportsman's Club. He brought a table in here tonight. Dave, where are you? All right, we'll get that right out to you, Dave. The famous one.
This is the famous scope. This is the first scope that Randy and I put our heads together and designed for the 450 Bushmaster. Has the dial on it, ready to go.
Larry Levine. Larry gets one. Gary Rock. Gary's cut right there. Gary. Yeah, we're there. Well, we got this cooler.
I thought you. Oh, you got.
All right, the very next one, Dave Johnson. Dave Johnson. All right, C9, very slim, 7-shot, super carry gun, has a safety on the side, economical. $229, I think, is what we're selling those for today, for a heck of a gun there. And that gun, I thought that, Earl Cook Q89, which is a mid-size, beautiful feeling gun. If you have not put that in your hands, you really need to. It just melts right in there. They really did ergonomically the perfect thing on that firearm. This guy, Bill, how many 450s did you sell for me? Here, Bill Pearson, where are you? You get this one. Well deserved. I believe when I first brought this gun out, Bill said, you know, I think I can sell a couple of them. Carbine. The PC Carbine, as Tom was letting you know earlier, is just a super cool design. They had one back 20 years ago that was a PC-9 or a PC-40. It did not take down in half the way these do today. Was not near as reliable. Did not use, and again, we hate to use a swear word here, but this is actually Glock magazine capacity. So if you've got a Glock, you can get this carbine. Comes with a Ruger magazine and the Glock adapter, so you can use either one. John Oobs, great. Terrific response. Thank you for all of these. You have a number system on your tickets. Get those out. Everybody got them? They're from the NRA of all things. And let's let Jenny Olson. I better check it out. All right, so he's got a wonderful gun shop up in Rose City. If you ever get up that way, 3/4 of a mile to be west of the main downtown intersection. One of a kind gun. You want to see what it is? All right, let's show him. Whoa, hang on. How about I give you $200 for it? $400. This gun. This gun and that gun. This gun and that gun. You sure? This is a one-of-a-kind gun. You don't know what it's going to be. How about if I gave you a PC carbine? You don't want that either. You know what's in here? $500 cash. You just want the gun? You guys are all my witnesses. So, limited edition, one of a kind, you'll never see again, has a scope on it. A cart gun. So here's what he gets for being, it is signed by Magnaport. Has a variable scope. You just adjust this in and out for your stock length. It's an adjustable door, so it's a different caliber depending on how you cut that off. Thank you, sir.